I thought I had it all figured out. At 28, I was about to become the youngest director at Vertex Engineering. My career was soaring, and I had plans to celebrate with the only family I had left, my cousin James and his wife Heather. Little did I know my night of triumph would turn into a showdown that would test family bonds and force me to stand my ground in my own home. The house that had been in our family for generations was about to become the center of a power struggle I never saw coming. Before I tell you how my night of celebration turned into a family showdown, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit subscribe if you want to see more stories about family drama and unexpected twists. I never planned on sharing my home with anyone after my parents died. 4 years ago, when I was 24, a drunk driver took both my mom and dad in an instant. I was an only child, suddenly alone, and inheriting a 5-bedroom colonial in one of the nicest neighborhoods in town. The house had been in our family for 3 generations, lovingly maintained and updated by my parents over the years. Those first months alone were the hardest of my life. I would come home from my job at Vertex Engineering to an empty house filled with memories and silence. Every creak in the floorboards reminded me of my dad's footsteps. Every hint of my mom's favorite perfume lingering in their bedroom would bring me to my knees. I was drowning in grief while trying to manage a mortgage, property taxes, and all the responsibilities my parents had handled. My cousin James had always been like a brother to me. Growing up, we spent every summer together fishing at the lake behind the property. When we were teenagers, we converted the attic into our own personal hangout spot, complete with a vintage pinball machine my dad found at an estate sale. James was 4 years older, but he never treated me like a kid. He taught me to drive in my dad's old pickup, covered for me when I stayed out too late, and was there for me at the funeral, his arm steady around my shoulders when my knees threatened to buckle. So when James called me 8 months ago, his voice tight with stress, to tell me he had been laid off from the manufacturing plant where he had worked for 10 years, I didn't hesitate. "Why don't you and Heather move in here for a while?" I offered. "Until you get back on your feet. This place is too big for just me anyway." James protested at first, but his situation was dire. The manufacturing industry in our town had been hit hard, and positions matching his skills were scarce. His wife Heather had a part-time job at a local boutique, but it wasn't enough to cover their rent and mounting bills. After a week of gentle insistence from me, they accepted. "Just until I find something stable," James had promised. "We will help with utilities and maintenance, of course." We never discussed formal rent. I didn't need the money, and it felt wrong to charge family who were struggling. Besides, having them around breathed life back into the old house. James fixed things I had been neglecting, and we fell back into our old easy rhythms, grilling on weekends and watching football games together. Heather was pleasant enough initially. I had only met her a few times before they moved in. James had met her 3 years ago, and they had a small wedding I attended while still in college. She was attractive with carefully highlighted blonde hair and a penchant for designer labels that seemed at odds with their financial situation. She worked part-time at an upscale clothing boutique, which she reminded us gave her a professional eye for quality and style. The first few months of our arrangement went smoothly. We established basic house rules, shared cooking responsibilities, and respected each other's privacy. James spent his days applying for jobs and picking up handyman work when he could find it. I focused on my career at Vertex, where I had been steadily climbing the ranks since joining straight out of college 6 years earlier. Looking back, I should have noticed the subtle shift in Heather's behavior around the 6-month mark. It started with small things. She began rearranging furniture without asking. She complained about my choice of laundry detergent. She questioned why I needed such a large bedroom when it was just me. But these seemed like minor annoyances, not warning signs. James finally found a new position at a smaller company. The relief on his face when he told me was genuine, but I could tell from his careful wording that the salary was significantly lower than what he had been making. Still, it was a start. I expected they might begin looking for their own place, but the subject never came up. What I didn't tell either of them was that I had been working with my family's lawyer to formally transfer the property into my name. When my parents died, their will left everything to me, but there were technical details and tax implications that took time to sort through. I chose not to bring this up, with James not wanting to emphasize that I owned the house they were living in. It seemed unnecessary and potentially hurtful to remind him of the different paths our lives had taken. Meanwhile, my career was accelerating. I had been leading an innovative infrastructure project that had caught the attention of senior management. For 2 years, I had been working 60-hour weeks, refining a design approach that could save millions in construction costs while improving structural integrity. My team respected me, and my immediate supervisor had hinted that a promotion might be coming if the final presentation went well. I never imagined how quickly my personal and professional worlds would collide, or how a day that began with such promise would end with me questioning everything I thought I knew about family loyalty. The morning of my presentation, I woke up before my alarm. I had rehearsed my slides countless times, knew every data point by heart, and still felt my stomach churning with anticipation. This was the culmination of 2 years of work, and the executive team, including our CEO, Richard Harmon, would be in attendance. I picked my best suit, the charcoal gray one I had splurged on last year, paired with a deep blue tie my mom had given me for my college graduation. "This color brings out your eyes," she had told me. "Wear it when you need to make an impression." I could almost feel her straightening my collar as I looked in the mirror. The presentation room was intimidating with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. 12 executives sat around the polished conference table, Richard at the head, his expression unreadable. I had 45 minutes to convince them that my approach wasn't just innovative, but implementable and profitable. As I began speaking, my nervousness faded. This was my element. I walked them through the problems with traditional methods, introduced my alternative approach, and presented the data from our successful pilot implementation. By the time I reached my conclusion, Richard was leaning forward in his chair, nodding subtly. "The numbers speak for themselves," I said, displaying the projected cost savings. "But what they don't show is how this approach can become our competitive advantage in bidding for the Andrews project next quarter." The room was silent for a moment after I finished. Then Richard stood up. "Luke, when your supervisor recommended you for this presentation, I was skeptical," he said, his voice firm. "You're young, but what you've shown us today demonstrates the kind of innovative thinking that built this company." He extended his hand to me. "Congratulations, Director Peterson, the youngest in company history, I believe." The rest of the executive team applauded, and several approached with congratulations. My supervisor clapped me on the back, beaming with pride. We had a celebratory lunch where Richard outlined my new responsibilities and the substantial salary increase that came with the position. My head was spinning with plans for the house renovations I could finally afford to complete. As soon as I left the office, I called James. I got it. I told him, unable to keep the excitement from my voice. "They made me a director. That's incredible." James sounded genuinely thrilled. "We need to celebrate tonight. I'll tell Heather to be home on time." I stopped at a specialty market on the way home, picking up an expensive bottle of champagne prime steaks and ingredients for twice-baked potatoes, my dad's specialty that he had taught me to make. I wanted this dinner to be special, not just for my promotion, but because James had been so supportive throughout the process, listening to me practice presentations and offering feedback. When I arrived home around 4 o'clock, I was surprised to hear Heather's voice. She must have taken off work early. I was about to announce my presence when I heard her tone sharp and irritated. "I don't care what Luke's career news is," she was saying to someone on the phone. "I'm tired of living like this, like we're still college roommates or something. It's time for changes around here." I quietly retreated to the kitchen, unsettled by her words, but focused on preparing dinner. By the time James arrived home at 5:30, I had the table set and the steaks marinating. "Director Peterson," he announced as he walked in, arms spread wide for a hug. "Man, I am so proud of you. Dad would have been over the moon." His mention of my father, so casual and heartfelt, brought unexpected tears to my eyes that I quickly blinked away. Heather emerged from upstairs wearing a new-looking dress that I recognized from the boutique where she worked. She offered a tight smile and obligatory congratulations, but seemed distracted, checking her phone frequently throughout dinner preparation. Once we were seated with our food, and I had poured the champagne, I shared the details of the promotion, the new projects I would be overseeing, and the team I would be building. James raised his glass. "To my brilliant cousin. Nobody deserves this more." We clinked glasses, and I felt a surge of gratitude for having him in my life, the last connection to my parents in childhood. Then Heather cleared her throat. "Actually, we have some news too." Her voice took on an unnaturally sweet tone that immediately put me on alert. "James, do you want to tell him?" James smiled, looking both nervous and excited. "We're having a baby. Heather is 3 months along." For a moment, my own news was forgotten as I processed this information. "That's wonderful," I said, and meant it. "Congratulations to both of you." I raised my glass again, noticing Heather had barely touched her champagne, which now made sense. Thank you, Heather said, placing her hand protectively over her still flat stomach. Which brings us to some necessary changes we need to discuss. The shift in conversation was abrupt, and I noticed James tense slightly beside her. With the baby coming, we need to start preparing, she continued. Your bedroom would make the perfect nursery, Luke. It's the largest after the master, has the morning sun, and is right next to the bathroom. I blinked, trying to process what she was suggesting. You want me to move to a different room? Well, ideally the basement, Heather said smoothly. It has that separate entrance, and you're gone most of the day anyway. It would give us the proper family space upstairs. James shifted uncomfortably. What Heather means is that with your new position, you'll probably want more privacy anyway, and we could use the extra room for the baby. But Heather wasn't done. And since you're getting such a big promotion, we should probably formalize our living arrangement. If you're staying, we think you should pay rent. Or her eyes narrowed slightly, it might be time for you to find your own place. You can certainly afford it now. The silence that followed was deafening. I looked between them, trying to understand what was happening. James wouldn't meet my eyes, focusing intently on his plate. Heather stared back defiantly, as if daring me to object. I see, I said finally, my voice much calmer than I felt. And when would you want these changes to happen? We'll need to start setting up the nursery within the next month, Heather said confidently. So you should decide quickly whether you're moving downstairs or moving out. In that moment, looking at the calculated expression on Heather's face and the uncomfortable resignation on James's, I realized with perfect clarity that I had been far too naive about our living arrangement. The champagne in my glass suddenly tasted bitter. I set it down carefully, aware that my hands wanted to shake with the anger rising inside me. The audacity of what Heather was suggesting was almost incomprehensible. This was my house, where I had grown up, where every inch held memories of my parents, and she was telling me to move to the basement or leave entirely. So just to make sure I understand, I said slowly, maintaining eye contact with Heather, you want me to either relocate to the basement of this house, start paying you rent, or move out completely. Is that correct? It just makes sense, Heather replied with a dismissive wave. You're hardly ever home with your work schedule, and now with this promotion, you'll be even busier. We need the space for our growing family. I turned to James, who was still studying his plate with intense focus. James, is this something you both discussed? He finally looked up, conflict evident in his expression. We did talk about needing more space for the baby, he said carefully. But I thought we would discuss options together, all three of us. Heather shot him an irritated glance. There aren't that many options, James. This house has 5 bedrooms, and we need at least 3 for a proper family home. 1 for us, 1 for the baby, and 1 as a guest room for when my parents visit. And what are your long-term plans, I asked, genuinely curious about how far this assumption extended. How long do you see yourselves living here? The question seemed to surprise Heather. Well, it's a perfect family home in an excellent school district. Why would we leave? And there it was. The unspoken assumption that had apparently been building for months. In Heather's mind, they weren't temporary guests in my home. They were settling in permanently, and I was the one who should leave. So your plan was always to stay indefinitely, I pressed. Luke, your parents would have wanted a family living here, Heather said, her voice taking on a sanctimonious tone that made my blood boil. Not just a single guy using it as a crash pad between work shifts. My child deserves a proper family home, and this house is perfect. I stood up abruptly. Excuse me for a minute. I walked to my home office, which had been my father's before him, unlocked the desk drawer, and retrieved a folder of documents I had received from my attorney last month. My hands were steady now, my mind clear. I returned to the dining room, where James and Heather were having a hushed, tense exchange that stopped the moment I appeared. I placed the folder on the table and opened it, turning it to face them. I think there's been a misunderstanding about the ownership of this house. Heather leaned forward, squinting at the legal documents. What are these supposed to be? Property deeds? Mortgage documents? My parents' will. The title transfer that was completed last month. I tapped each document as I named it. This house legally belongs to me. It always has since my parents died. I inherited it along with everything in it. The color drained from Heather's face. But you never said anything about owning it outright. Why would I? I asked honestly. You were family in need. I offered you a place to stay until you got back on your feet. I never asked for rent, because I don't need the money, and I wanted to help. James looked genuinely shocked. Luke, I had no idea the property was fully in your name. I thought maybe there was still a mortgage, or that it was complicated because of the inheritance. It was complicated, I acknowledged. That's why the final title transfer just happened recently. But the house has always been mine to offer. Heather's expression transformed rapidly from shock to calculation. Well, that doesn't really change anything, she said, her tone softening artificially. We're still family, and now that we're having a baby, we should discuss the best arrangement for everyone. I just thought with your promotion you might want your own space anyway. My own space, I repeated flatly. In the basement of my own house. Or somewhere else entirely. I didn't mean it like that, Heather backtracked. Of course this is your house. We just thought since you've been so generous already, you might want to continue helping family, especially with a baby on the way. I took a deep breath, calming the anger that threatened to overwhelm me. This wasn't just about Heather's assumption or her entitlement. It was about the betrayal I felt from both of them, but especially from James, who had been like a brother to me. I had a plan, I said quietly. When I invited you to stay here, I was going to help you save enough for a down payment on your own place. That's why I never asked for rent. I figured every dollar you saved could go toward your future home. I was going to offer to match what you saved as a gift to help you get established. James looked stricken. Luke, I had no idea. Because I never said it out loud, I admitted. I should have been clearer. But I never imagined you would assume this house would become yours by default. It's not like that, James protested, but his voice lacked conviction. Then what is it like, I asked, genuinely wanting to understand. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you and Heather decided that my home would eventually become yours without ever discussing it with me. James had the decency to look ashamed. We never explicitly talked about it that way. But I guess over time, as we settled in, I should have been more thoughtful about our conversations and plans. Heather, seeing her position weakening, tried a different approach. You can't just throw us out now. I'm pregnant, for goodness sake. What kind of person makes their family homeless when there's a baby on the way? I'm not throwing you out tonight, I said firmly. But I think it's time we establish some clear boundaries and expectations. I looked directly at James. You have 3 months to find your own place. I'll still help with the down payment as I planned, but this living arrangement is no longer working. 3 months isn't enough time, Heather protested immediately. The housing market is terrible right now. 3 months is generous, I countered. Most landlords would give 30 days notice. But we're not tenants, we're family, she argued. Yes, you are family, I agreed, looking at James. Which is why I'm offering financial help toward your new home, despite everything that's been said tonight. James nodded slowly, a mixture of gratitude and shame in his expression. Thank you, Luke. That's more than fair. Heather opened her mouth to argue further, but James placed his hand over hers in a silent plea to stop. For once, she seemed to read the room correctly, and remained silent, though her eyes blazed with barely contained anger. The remainder of the evening passed in uncomfortable silence. The food went largely uneaten, the champagne flat in our glasses. What should have been a night of celebration had become a painful fracturing of family bonds. As James and Heather retreated upstairs, I remained at the dining table surrounded by half-eaten food and legal documents, wondering how things had gone so wrong. The week following our confrontation was tense, to say the least. Heather avoided me entirely, leaving rooms when I entered and scheduling her work hours to minimize our contact. James, caught in an impossible position between his wife and his cousin, attempted awkward small talk that quickly died under the weight of unresolved feelings. On Friday, I came home to find James waiting for me in the kitchen. Heather's car was gone, and he had made coffee a peace offering of sorts. Can we talk? He asked, gesturing to the kitchen table, where we had spent countless hours as kids doing homework under my mom's watchful eye. I nodded, pouring myself a cup before sitting across from him. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I'm sorry, James finally said, his voice thick with emotion. I should have shut down Heather's assumptions months ago. I knew it wasn't right, but I guess it was easier to go along with it than confront the reality of our situation. Which is, I prompted. That we've been struggling more than I let on, he admitted. This new job pays barely enough to cover basic expenses. The idea of saving for a house seemed impossible, so when Heather started talking about making a life here long-term, he trailed off ashamed. You should have talked to me, I said simply. I would have helped you figure something out. I know that now. He looked up, his expression pained. But pride is a hell of a thing, Luke. Watching my younger cousins surpass me professionally while I'm starting over at 40% less salary than I used to make. It's been harder than I wanted to admit. I hadn't considered how our reversed fortunes might have affected him. James had always been the successful one growing up, the one with clear plans and ambitions. Life had altered that dynamic dramatically. Heather didn't tell me she was planning to confront you that night, he continued. I knew she wanted to discuss the baby in space, but the way she approached it, the ultimatum, that blindsided me too. Has she been planning this for a while? I asked. James nodded reluctantly. Since we found out about the baby, maybe before? She's been talking about redecorating, looking at nursery ideas online, measuring the rooms when you weren't home. He looked genuinely regretful. I should have stepped in. I'm sorry I didn't. His apology was sincere, and while it didn't erase the hurt, it helped me understand how we had arrived at this point. I meant what I said about helping with a down payment, I told him. I've already spoken with my financial advisor about setting aside $30,000 as a gift for you. It should be enough for a decent start in this market. James's eyes widened. Luke, that's incredibly generous, especially after everything. You're still my family, I said simply. The only close family I have left. I'm not going to let this situation ruin that completely. Over the following weeks, a fragile peace settled over the house. James began actively house hunting, looking at modest homes and apartments within their budget range. Heather, while still cool toward me, had stopped making pointed comments about the house being a family home. Reality had set in. 2 months after our confrontation, James excitedly told me they had found a small 3-bedroom house about 20 minutes away. With my gift and a first-time homebuyer program, they qualified for a manageable mortgage. They would be moving at the end of the month, well within the 3-month timeline I had established. Moving day was predictably awkward. Heather directed the movers with military precision, barely acknowledging my presence. James, however, made a point of finding me alone in the kitchen as the last boxes were being loaded. I never properly thanked you, he said. Not just for the money, but for giving us a place when we needed it most. I'm sorry about how things ended. It's not really ending, I pointed out. We're just establishing healthier boundaries. He nodded, looking relieved. The new place is small, but it's a start. Our start. He hesitated, then added, I'd like you to be part of my kid's life, Luke. Whatever happened between us, that's important to me. I'd like that too, I said honestly. We hugged briefly before he followed the movers out to the truck, where Heather was impatiently waiting. As they drove away, the house fell silent, in a way it hadn't been for nearly a year. The silence was both lonely and liberating. Thanksgiving that year was an exercise in forced politeness at my aunt and uncle's house. Heather, now visibly pregnant, managed civil conversation with me, while focusing most of her attention on her in-laws. James and I found moments to reconnect, talking about sports and his new job prospects with an ease that reminded me of better times. 6 months after they moved out, James called to invite me to the hospital. His son, Thomas James, had arrived early that morning. Despite everything standing in that hospital room holding my tiny cousin, I felt the undeniable pull of family connection. James beamed with pride, and even Heather seemed genuinely pleased by my visit and the savings bond I had brought as a gift. Over the following months, I threw myself into work and finally completed the house renovations I had been planning. I updated the kitchen with new appliances and granite countertops, refinished the hardwood floors, and repainted every room, removing the last traces of the temporary arrangement with James and Heather. The change that brought me the most unexpected joy came through Sarah, a landscape architect who moved in next door. What started as casual conversations about property lines and shared fence maintenance evolved into coffee dates and eventually dinner. For the first time since my parents died, the house began to feel like a true home again, filled with possibility rather than just memories. A year after that fateful dinner, my relationship with James had stabilized into something new, yet familiar. We weren't as close as before, but we had regular fishing trips with little Thomas strapped to James's chest in a baby carrier. Heather remained distant, but civil, seemingly content, in their modest home that they were slowly making their own. The experience taught me that family obligation has limits, and setting healthy boundaries doesn't make you selfish or uncaring. Sometimes the hardest boundaries to establish are with the people closest to us, but they're often the most necessary. My parents raised me to be generous and kind, but they also taught me to stand up for myself with dignity and respect. The house remains mine, a sanctuary and security that I now appreciate more deeply. But I've learned that while property provides security, it's the relationships in our lives the healthy ones built on mutual respect that constitute true wealth. Have you ever had to stand your ground with family? Share your experience in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell if you want more stories about finding balance between family obligation and self-respect. Remember, sometimes the hardest boundaries to set are the ones we need most. Thank you for listening to my story, and I hope it helps someone facing similar challenges with their own family dynamics.